In this lesson, we'll continue building our first mini project, a poster design for XYZ Consulting. Okay, so in the last lesson we had kind of laid out the specifications and the process for this particular project. Now I've also got these ellipses that we ended up with in the previous lesson on screen. I worked on those a little bit more with that smudge tool, and I hope you did too. But let's go ahead and at this point open up our Lesson 6 Begin file here. Now that file should be in your Photoshop Files folder within your project files, and it should look something like this. So now let's talk about this image and why I chose to use this image for this particular project. So we talked early on, or rather in the last lesson, about using a kind of the humor angle as an avenue for communicating our message with this poster. So we talked about wanting to communicate the fact that sexual harassment is not acceptable in sort of a humorous, subtle fashion, so that visitors to the office, maybe they don't see that there's a problem in this office. So this particular image has this gentleman on it, and he's got this very shocked, taken back look on his face. So there's a lot being communicated already through this picture. Already it's drawing you in, making you wonder what's going on here. What has this gentleman so taken back? Now, all we need to do at this point is add purpose or reason to that for this particular image. And we can do that based on our sketches that we talked about in the last lesson. We talked about adding maybe some lipstick to his face. Maybe he's been the victim of this harassment instead of a female, like one might originally or might automatically assume. So now this particular image, if you notice down here in the bottom left hand corner, is watermarked, and it is actually provided to us courtesy of iStock Photo. Now this is actually referred to as stock imagery, and it is quite common in the design world. Now, obviously, in a perfect world, a designer is going to have the funding, they're going to have the time, and they're also going to have the equipment to maybe go out and bring in a model and take the photograph that they need for the poster. Now, in this particular case, this isn't a real client, but we're treating this as a real project, so I've opted to use a piece of stock photography from iStock Photo. Now, sites like iStock provide a large amount of photos, in this case, that can be incorporated into your designs and may merit you checking out at some point in your design career. But for this particular project, let's go ahead and just assume this is the image we're going to use, and we're going to build our design off of this base. So now, in the last lesson, we learned about the crop tool a little bit. Let's go ahead and use it again. I'm going to come over here and click on it, and notice here up in the control panel up here at the top, I've turned off that delete cropped pixels option. I want to keep the pixels we crop off, just so in case I crop it and I'm not happy with that crop result, I can come back in and I can adjust that later on. So now I'm going to come in and grab this side control, and we're just going to kind of squish this in some, and maybe grab this corner down here and pull it up some. Now, let's talk just briefly about composition. We haven't mentioned composition yet in this course, but it is a term you should be familiar with if you've watched Kurt's Foundations of Art course. So composition is definitely important when it comes to graphic design as well, and we're going to focus on it a little bit more later on in this course. But in terms of this particular project, we had this gentleman, and he was smack dab in the middle of our poster. So what I want to do is I want to draw attention to the fact that we're going to put some lipstick on his left cheek. So I'm going to use what's known as the rule of thirds here, and it's actually right here under this view drop down. You can see it's set to rule of thirds. It's built into the crop tool, and we can see that here with this grid of 9 boxes. So the way this rule works, if you don't recall, is that what we want to do is we want to align things of visual interest or focus in our image with the intersections of these lines. So if we want to put that lipstick right about here, then I want to try and get this intersection fairly close to that position. So I'm going to come over here just like so, maybe pull this top down just a little bit. Now, obviously, there are some things that we haven't discussed in terms of if this was a production piece. This isn't actually going to go to a printer to be printed, but if it was, there would be things like resolution that we would need to consider. There would be things like the dimensions of this poster. Does it meet with the dimensions that we need? Things of that nature. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and we're just going to assume that we are meeting all of those specifications right now ahead of time. And I'm going to drag that up so we don't have just the very tip of his hair touching the top of the poster. And once we've got this positioned, let's go ahead and hit enter on our keyboard. Now, if we ever need to come in and move this around, we just need to grab our move tool here and just simply click on that layer and drag it around. You can see that those pixels outside of the cropped area, they still exist. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. I was pretty happy with the way we cropped this originally. So this is going to work great as far as a base for our poster here. But the next thing I want to do here is I want to color correct this a little bit. I want to bring the tones, the values of color, I want to kind of pull them back a little bit so we're not quite so vibrant here. So we're going to use that same hue saturation adjustment that we used in the previous lesson, but instead of changing the channel to the reds up here, I'm going to go ahead and just leave it set to master, and I'm going to dial the saturation back here, and just kind of looking at it here on the canvas as I do this, I'm going to drag that down to about -40. Now in doing that, I think we could also add a little bit more drama to this image by beefing up the contrast a little bit, making the whites a little bit brighter, making the blacks and the dark shadowed areas a little bit darker. So we can do that again as well with another adjustment layer right over here, same location as before, and we're going to come up to this brightness and contrast adjustment. Now this one only has 2 sliders, and we're not going to touch the brightness. I'm actually going to grab the contrast, and if we drag it to the left, you'll notice that we're going in the opposite direction. The contrast is lowering. The whites aren't as bright. The dark shadowed areas aren't as dark. So let's go ahead and drag it to the right. I'm going to beef that up. Maybe right about there. How about 40 or so? I think that'll work just fine. So with these 2 adjustments made, I'm happy with the colors and the tone as well as the cropping of our image. So now it's time to go ahead and bring in our lips. Now, if you remember, we saved those in the referenced file folder. So I'm going to come over here to File, and we'll just choose Place. And you'll see here that we've got the referenced file folder visible here. So let's go ahead and scroll down until we find our lips cropped file. And we'll just simply hit this place button here. And you'll see that Photoshop drops it right smack in the center of our canvas, which that's okay, we can start there. But I'm actually going to move that around a little bit. Just simply by clicking on it and dragging it, I'll position it kind of over his cheek right there. Now, if we wanted to make it bigger or smaller at this point, we could just by using these control handles right here. I'm going to go ahead and leave it as it is because I want to show you when I hit Enter. Over here in the Layers panel, we have this little icon next to the thumbnail of the layer. This indicates that this is a smart object. Now, you'll notice here in this course, we're not diving too deep into the software. We've got courses later on that you can check out and learn all about the software. What I really want you to grasp here is the why. The reason I'm making the decisions I'm making, and so you can take this information and begin to apply it to your own work within your whatever projects you're working on. So rather than go into a lengthy discussion about smart objects, let's just say that that's going to preserve the original appearance of the image for us. So we can make changes over here on our canvas, and if we ever needed to, we could double click on it and we could come back over here to the original. So with that said, let's go ahead and change the blend mode. We've got this big nasty white square around our lips. I'm going to change this over to multiply, just like so, and you'll see that that disappears. So what that's doing is it's allowing the pixels underneath, right here, to show through the lips. So if we were to move these up over his eye, you can see here we can actually see his eye through the lips. But because we're targeting this area on his cheek, I think that this is going to work just fine. So the next area we need to address here is the fact that these lips are facing us, and we want to put them on his cheek right here. So we're going to need to do a little bit of transforming to these lips as they are to make it believable that they're fitting onto his cheek. So to do that, we're going to use something called a free transform, and that's up here under the Edit menu. So we'll come in and choose that option here. It's also Control T if you are a fan of keyboard shortcuts. So with the free transform, we get, again, this control, or this bounding box around our lips. And what we can do is we can begin to grab and stretch and transform these. We can hold Shift if we want to scale, just like so. But the free transform option does so much more, really, because what we can actually do is we can start to hold Control, and we can begin to move individual corners around, just like so. Now, let me undo that here, because before I do that, I'm actually going to rotate it just by mousing over the corner until I receive this cursor. We'll rotate this and position these maybe right about there. Now, if he has been kissed, then, and we're seeing it from this angle, this is going to appear to be a bit skewed. So we could come in here and start to skew that by grabbing this control and holding down Control while we're doing this, dragging it this direction, dragging it this direction. I'm going to go ahead and drag it over to right about here, maybe squish it down a little bit, maybe grab this corner right here. Again, all I'm doing is holding down the Control key, and we're starting to kind of morph these lips into a position where it's believable that they're kind of at an angle away from the camera here. So if we were to come in like so, and now we hit Enter, you'll notice here that our lips look a little bit different. Now, we've got a little bit of a problem. We've got a little piece of those lips hanging off, and they're actually covering up his earlobe here. So that is actually the last thing we're going to fix here with this little mini project to make this a little more believable. So before we do that, though, let's come over here and kind of look at how vibrant those lips are. They're actually really bouncing off the image, really apparent, and it almost looks a little bit fake. So I might pull those back a little bit by adjusting the opacity of the layer. You can click on the word opacity and drag it to the left and to the right to do that, or you can simply click this little drop down and adjust this slider right here. So I'm going to drop that down to around 80 or 85% or so. That looks a little bit more believable to me. And now we're going to create what's known as a layer mask. What that's going to allow us to do is hide information that's on this layer. So that button's right down here. It looks like a white square with a black dot in it. And when I click that, you'll see this mask appear right over the or to the right of the thumbnail for our smart object. So you'll also notice that there's a little chain link linking the two. We're not going to get into that in this course, but let's go ahead and we're going to come over to our tool panel here, and let's find the button that looks like a paintbrush. This is going to be our brush tool. So the brush tool is going to allow us to, if we have a normal layer selected, just paint on that layer. Now, if we have, in this case, a mask selected, like you can see we do with these little white corners around the mask, what we're going to be able to do is paint grayscale information into this mask to either hide or reveal information on the layer. So you'll notice here that by default the mask is filled with white. You can see a preview of it here. White means that everything is revealed. If we want to start to hide things, we need to paint in black. So let me go ahead and dial up my opacity here so my brush is working at full strength. We'll zoom in on this a little bit, and let me just come in and right click, and let's start with this soft round, and I'm actually going to beef the hardness up to around 50% or so. Let's shrink it down some as well. There we go. That should work. Now, important thing to remember here is we need to paint with black. So we want to paint with black at full intensity, so make sure that this is set to black. This is your foreground color. And if we come in now, we're going to start to be able to paint out the extra pieces of those lips that we don't want here. So we'll come in here and just sort of start to paint that back just like so. That's starting to look pretty good. Now, one thing I might do, if I zoom out and look at that, it still seems very, very bright right here as well as right here. So there's not a lot of contrast between the two. And if this lip print was rolling around his face, we might see a little less intense reds right here near the edge. So let's come in here and we'll just again grab our soft round, which you can see adjusts our hardness all the way down. Go ahead and beef up my size just a little bit. And I'm going to drop that opacity back down, something rather low. So this means that we're painting with a 30% opaque black at this point. So if I come in now and I start to paint a nice soft stroke over that, you'll see that with one pass, it sort of softens that edge up just a bit. With a second pass, might actually be a little too much, but no, I think that'll actually work. That starts to look more believable because that red is not quite as intense here as it is here. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and call this particular project done. If we were to have this printed, there would be a whole nother set of steps we would need to go through. But I think that a poster like this effectively communicates that sexual harassment in the workplace is not permitted. We have a businessman here, and he has obviously been kissed on the cheek, and it's caused an adverse reaction in him. He's very shocked and almost appalled at what has happened to him. So a great visual reminder that this is not acceptable activity in the offices for XYZ Consulting.